Well, it's, you know, I often tell people that at my age it's a pleasure to be anywhere. But it's a really special pleasure to be here, you know. Had many good years at GMU and still come back on various occasions. So, and hope to do it many more times in the future. And my wife, Candace Smith, is accompanying me. She's sitting down here. And we always travel together. If she doesn't go, I don't go. Okay. And now I think she doesn't go unless I go, because she has independently various things that she does in connection with her teaching about rules and order around the table and on social occasions. Okay. Well, the title here, which is not displayed, but it is America the Beautiful in Dissent, and in First and 14th Amendment expansions of freedom. Now, this is really an exercise in oral history. A lot of what I'm going to talk about are stuff that's come out of my personal experience. But I want to reach for a little bit larger intellectual framework, okay, to better understand the experiential part of my participation in the American experiment. You see my experience, and that's well, that's now over 90 years. But I go back. There were some important events in my life that actually happened for 10 years, about 10 years before I was born. So I'm going to be going back to this. Now, if there's a theme here, it is that we live in dangerous times, but from our colonial beginnings, with its British roots, we've always lived in dangerous times. That's the story of America. It's the story of our political, social, and economic processes. It's the story of our Constitution and all the changes that have been made in it. And I don't want to say that there's nothing new today, but the point is that much of it is what's going on is really part of our heritage. And I believe we sputter and muddle through all these times because there are forms of social rationality in a culture of freedom that help us to sort through temporary versus lasting forms of adaptation. I think there's always that tension. People want to take you in the short run and in different directions because of the immediate circumstances. But the question is, how much should be that part of the permanent change? Now, I think the source of, the idea I want to try out on you is that the source of this rationality is in our commitment to order through rules, as against only searching for best apparent outcomes under whatever are the current prevailing conditions. The result is a conflict to be resolved or continued until we are ready for a resolution. Okay? And you see, almost of all of our theorizing is about outcomes. And it's not really the roots that may be driving the rules we follow. And you see that particularly in economics, where utility is essentially utility for everything. Okay, you've got action produces an outcome, produces a utility. And it's kind of an if and only if statement. So all our models tend to have a utilitarian basis. Now that's new with the neoclassical revolution, intellectual revolution of the 1870s. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but we abandoned a lot of truth when we did that. That was in the classical tradition. And that's not my subject today, but it's something that I'm busy writing and researching now. And the thing is, context matters in action. And not only the rewards and the distribution of rewards. And there's no place better to learn that than in Adam Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, because that's all about the emergence of our sociability out of ancient rules that kind of emerge by consent in groups, okay? And those become, some of those rules became, in the civil order of things, what we call the rule of law. So, and some of the evidence for this is experimental. In the 1980s and 90s, we had a lot of two-person single-play games played anonymously that we couldn't understand the results at all. These were trust and ultimatum games. And in those games, people were cooperating way more than they should have been because they had this wonderful opportunity to anonymously take all the money, and they weren't doing it, you see. And I didn't have really a satisfactory explanation for any of that until I finally started to understand what Adam Smith was saying in his first book. And then it all became clear because his propositions easily predict those and a bunch of new stuff, okay? Because he's modeling relationships, and the context matters. And context in a game means all the payoffs, okay? And so, but I also want to ask, what's the cultural evidence? Is there any cultural evidence that for Americans, along with others in the Western tradition, our concern is for rules, not only outcomes? Well, let me give it to you. In the 17th and 18th century English, the word fair meant fair play, not fairness of outcomes. The opposite of fair was foul. Moreover, and many of you are not going to believe this, but you can get the references and read it. Moreover, fair is a unique English word. It is not translatable into any other language. Look and see what the German word for fair is. It's English fair. They've just borrowed the word, and it's similar in Polish. And the French won't borrow words, so they just don't have that word, okay? But all the others do. And this comes, the best source on this is Anna Wysbicka. Get her great book. She has written several pieces on English and some of its uniqueness, but just the one I go back to is the one just entitled English. And she will, you read that and you'll see that it is really quite convincing, you see. So any action was fair if it was not a breach of the accepted rules of socioeconomic order. In the civil order, it meant that actions were subject to the rule of law. But what I'm trying to suggest is that its sources are far, far deeper, okay? Remember, these English language settlers who had this notion of fair play, you see, in their language, they moved to North America, okay, to Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, about the same time that we were starting this resurgence in a big upsurgence in growth in economic welfare per capita, which the historians have abundantly documented. Well, that tradition, I think, among many others, for example, the alienability of land, took the form of First and 14th Amendment protections of freedom of speech, or now that is widely interpreted as expression, okay, association, and assembly. and protections of that from invasion by state and federal lawmaking. And these freedoms became instruments of exploration, I think, and of discovery of new relations among diverse peoples. That's the thing that freedom does for you. Okay. Now the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and it essentially extended First Amendment freedoms to all citizens after the Civil War. And then in 1873, the Supreme Court tested its meaning in a famous slaughterhouse case in Louisiana in 1873. And here's the ruling, the essential part of it. Said the first clause in the 14th article was primarily intended to confer citizenship on the Negro race, and secondly, to give definitions of citizenship of the United States and citizenship of the states, and it recognizes the distinction between citizenship of the states and citizenship of the United States by these definitions, okay? The second clause protects from the hostile legislation of the states the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, as distinguished from the privileges and immunities of citizens of the states. These latter, the privileges and immunities of the states, embrace generally those fundamental civil rights for the security and establishment of which organized society is instituted. And they remain, with certain exceptions mentioned in the federal Constitution, under the care of the state government. So what this is saying is, essentially, is that civil rights protection, that for civil rights protection, state citizenship had priority over U.S. citizenship. And this ruling then enabled laws in the former slave states to favor segregation and discrimination until it was finally challenged in Brown versus Topeka, a famous case, of course, 1954 in Kansas, in which separating children in public schools on the basis of race was declared unconstitutional. Now, that took over 80 years, you see, for that to happen. And it happened in Kansas, which was a free state, you see. And I'm going to come back to Kansas, the free state, because that's where, where I grew up. Now, I'll have a lot to say about what it was like if you were concerned about racial discrimination and growing up there. Well, I was born in 1927, and to give you the context, that's Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs in 1927, and a very distinguished French Catholic priest who was a physicist, Lemaitre, published the Big Bang Theory. It wasn't called at that time, but he took Einstein's general theory and showed that that it implied an expanding universe. And it was another 15 or 20 years before the term Big Bang was invented, and it stuck, and that's what we called it ever since. So, and also it was the 200th anniversary of the death of Isaac Newton, 1927. So it's a great year. Now, I was raised in a family, an extended family, with several unique characteristics. And we were largely indigenous American socialists. And American socialism became something very different than it did elsewhere. And I'll talk a little about that. We were anti-war. We opposed all forms of racial discrimination. And we were committed to First and 14th Amendment rights. And we also held very strong ethics for work, saving, and innovation. And you see, the reason why these commitments to freedom could live within a context of supporting socialism is that none of us believed that work ethic, innovation, the incentive to innovate, none of us believed that would change. You see, that's part of the culture. And it was believed that there's no one understood how that might have come out of the economic freedom, you see, we had. And so so that's kind of and on the ethic for work. For example, my father was laid off. He was a machinist, worked for the Bridgeport Machine Company in Wichita. He was laid off in 1932. And then there were several times during the 30s when he had the opportunity to go on relief. And that was the WPA. Well, he refused to do it. It was demeaning. The attitude of a lot of people was that, my grandfather said WPA, that means we piddle around. You see, it was make work. And so you had these people, interesting people who you see, who were voting a socialist candidate and refusing to go on relief. Now my mother thought my father was being very unreasonable, of course, in this. So it wasn't as if there wasn't some argument in the family, but he wasn't about to do it. Okay, now I want to talk about Eugene Victor Debs. In my family, it was Gene Debs. It was like a member of the family. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a engineer on the Missouri Pacific. His twin brother was an engineer on the Santa Fe, and their brother-in-law was on the Rock Island Road as an engineer. My mother, who was married when she was 16, was married to Grover Boucher, who went to work. He was a fireman on the Santa Fe. He was killed instantly in 1918. At the time, my grandfather was recovering from a leg injury, that he'd been off work for about 6 months. A leg injury. Accidents were very common. Debs was a labor organizer, particularly worked in the railroad workers, and the main thing that he was emphasizing is working conditions. These were terribly dangerous times. You see, you had no infrastructure. Everything had to be coordinated with watches. There's a penalty if your watch is not running on time. If you're an engineer, there's a penalty if you are moving too fast. There's a penalty if you're moving too slow, because all of these things had to be coordinated, and it was coordinated with lights, with signals, flags, torpedoes. If the engineer fails to see some flags or red lights and he's approaching a dangerous thing, there's torpedoes on the track that explode. And maybe you'll hear those. Okay, this is the way it worked. So, so he was really, Gene Debs was a real icon, you see, of a railroad worker's family. Well, he was arrested, sent to Atlanta prison after a generic anti-war socialist speech that he made in June 1918. This was just 2 months after the start of World War I. And he was found guilty under the Espionage Act of 1917, which is still in force, and I'll come back to that if there's time. I want to talk a little about Dan the Pentagon Papers. Okay. Dan Ellsberg. Dan was I knew him slightly, but not well, at Harvard, and I want to say a little bit about that, because that's all part of this anti-war. And here's I'm giving you a quote from Debs' Canton, Ohio speech. He said, I realize in speaking to you this afternoon that there are certain limitations placed upon the right to free speech. I must be exceedingly careful, prudent, as to what I say, and even more careful and more prudent as to how I say it. I may not be able to say all I think, but I'm not going to say anything that I do not think. Well, he said enough things that that he thought that he was arrested, and it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and he lost that ruling. Now, there was a lot of civil resistance to World War I. And many believe that the repression of that resistance probably strengthened it. And for example, as socialist candidate for president, running from his jail cell in Atlanta, Debs polled almost 1 million votes. My mother was 24. This was the first time she voted. The women got the right to vote in 1919, you see. And she cast her treasured first vote for Eugene Victor Debs in jail, you see. There was about 350,000 draft-age men that failed to report to register for the draft in the First World War. Some 2,000 cases in the courts were charged under the Sedition Act. Now, the Sedition Act was passed in 1918, a year after the Espionage Act, and it forbade the use of disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the United States government, its flag, or its armed forces, or that caused others to view the American government or institutions with contempt. Now, Warren Harding, the Republican candidate who won the election, commuted Debs' sentence. He'd been sentenced for 10 years. He commuted the sentence, and this was a healing act. The conditions had changed. The attitudes were very different, you see. And he freed Debs along with 23 others imprisoned for their opposition to World War I. Now, 2 of them were communists who were released on condition that they go to the Soviet Union. Well, you know what happened to them there? They were executed, okay? And you see, this is the sort of thing that turned Debs and American socialists very much against the international Marxist movement, and it started to become a more independent affair. And interesting, the Sedition Act was repealed in 1921, less than 3 years after it was passed. Now, that gives you an idea of how fast populist sentiment, you see, can change. And people are now looking back on the First World War and its carnage as a grave mistake. Okay, now then Norman Thomas comes on the scene. Debs died in 1928, and Norman Thomas took over the Socialist Party and ran for president 6 times. Okay, he had been president of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. That's the leading Christian pacifist group in the United States, and I believe still is. The other, the non-Christian, is the War Resisters League. He was the co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union and a vigorous defender of rights of free speech. For example, Norman Thomas was very anti-communist, anti-Nazi in the 1930s, but he always said we should let him speak. But it shouldn't be suppressed. We should hear them out. He had a certain confidence, you see, that American people were not going to accept that stuff. And he was willing to run that sort of risk. And in fact, that is kind of a part of some of the Supreme Court doctrine in a sense. The question is whether there is a clear and present danger. And if in some sense there's not a clear and present danger, you let people speak, okay, and that's been had a variable life in Supreme Court decisions. But now in 1939, Thomas was a prominent critic of President Roosevelt's decision to turn away a boatload of Jewish refugees and forced to return to their Nazi fate in Europe. After Pearl Harbor, Thomas, indeed most of us in the anti-war movement, supported our entry into World War II. This was in keeping with Bertrand Russell's dictum. Bertrand Russell had been a conscientious objector, the philosopher, in the First World War in the United Kingdom, and his dictum was that there had only been 2 wars in history worth fighting: the American Revolution and the Second World War. And I would ask you to see if you can find any others that were. So in 1942, Thomas nearly broke with the ACLU because they supported the internment and dispossession of about 110 to 120,000 Japanese American citizens. His friends persuaded him to stay in the organization, that he could do more within it than on the outside, because the California chapter of the ACLU had not gone along with the national. And so Thomas became an important part of the defense that was mounted against some of the Japanese American citizens where their cases got into the courts. Now, he campaigned for arms control and kind of peacenik issues after the war, and American socialism as a political movement faded away. But the contribution to our freedom, I think, lives in ecologically rational Americana. You see, what stuck about the socialist movement, you see, is the part that had lasting benefits as seen by most Americans. And I think libertarians don't fully appreciate the extent to which there was a socialist heritage, you see, in the many of the policies that libertarians espouse. Okay, now I want to turn to Dissent against racial discrimination. And growing up in Kansas, we were trying to fight racial discrimination. It was like pushing on a string. Okay. It was a free state. We have First Amendment protections from invasion by state law, but discrimination against blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, it was widespread. Okay. Supported not by law, but practices. Okay. Now, I was a member of CORE. That's the Congress of Racial Equality. That was formed in 1940 by James Farmer and George Hausner. They were at George was at the University of Chicago, a student, and James Farmer was a citizen, a black citizen of Chicago. And the first breakthrough on the problems of widespread practice of discrimination occurred in 1943 in Chicago. CORE mounted a successful sit-in in the Jack Sprat restaurant. So what they did, a mixed group of blacks and whites, go into the restaurant, sit at a table, wanting to be served. The manager comes over and says, "I can't serve you." He says, "The blacks I'll serve in the kitchen. If you come around to the back door," that was the standard way that blacks could get food from a restaurant, is go to the back door, they'd feed you from the kitchen. But he said, "I can't serve you out here." They refused to move, wanted to be served. So they called the police. The manager called the police. The police come out. They said, there isn't any law being broken here. We can't do anything about this. So the manager served them. And that was it. After then, people went to Jack Spratt, and he served them, and it began to spread, you see. Now, there's something about that model that I really like. You see, it's coming right from the bottom, and you're going after the people that are in the trenches that are doing the discriminating, you see, and you're challenging that in a nonviolent way. They don't have the law on their side, and it was small in the 1940s. We in Wichita, we were trying to do it with the theaters, break down the discrimination in the theaters, and but you know they would cave in, but they wouldn't change their policies. You see. And then I want to talk about the University of Kansas, which is in Lawrence, Kansas, and now I'm coming up to, after I graduated from Caltech, I went to Kansas and I got a master's degree in economics. So I was there from 1949 to 1952. Now, campus housing for student housing at the University of Kansas was reserved for members of the Caucasian race only. So that meant Asians, Hispanics, blacks, all of it, nobody could, and there were some of these students at the University of Kansas, but they couldn't live on campus. Well, we had 6 private off-campus co-op houses. The co-op house movement, which was a private endeavor, was very strong there. And 5 of them were interracial. The one that wasn't, we used to call the poor girls Phi Chi. Okay. So I lived in a men's co-op with 17 men. We had 1 black and 2 Hispanics, and that was easily exceeded the ratio on campus. Okay, and that gave me the privilege, because I had a black housemate, of going to the Green Lantern in North Lawrence, which is an all-black bar. I could get in there with him. Once I went there when Andy wasn't with me, and the manager meets me at the door, and he says, "I'm sorry, I can't be responsible for you in here. I said, I'm not going. You can't come in. If Annie's with you, I can let you in." So so there's a Hispanic bar about 3 blocks away. So I go over to that one. And it's interesting. You see, I could go to the Hispanic bar without Benny Sanchez, one of my housemates. No way that my black housemate could get in to a Hispanic bar. Not with anyone. You know, there was a divide there that was just, you know, and it was everywhere. It's amazing. I don't understand all that, but anyway, that's the way we lived. We didn't have trouble with the university. We had trouble with our neighbors. In fact, we helped the university. We formed a couples co-op. Because several of us had gotten married, and we decided to form a couples co-op, and rented a house and added that to the set of co-op houses. And the university said, you know, he says, they approached us and said, "We have a black blind student that has to live close. And of course, she can't live on campus, but would you take her?" So the housemates, yes, it's unanimous, we'll take her. And we also decided to give her a scholarship. We'll just absorb her costs, you see. So Beulah joined us. And then later, the graduate girls moved in. That's what we called them, the Graduate Girls Co-op. I'm sorry, that was the name. and graduate girl, and one of them were black. And my neighbor stops me one day and says, "Well, now I can understand the first one, the blind one, but why did you let that other one in?" You see, and this is the sort of thing that you constantly lived with, and we had 2 lawsuits for that guy. Had nothing to do with any of these issues, but it had to do with harboring a barking dog. I mean, you get harassed, and they can't get anywhere with that issue, but there's something on the law books you see in the city about barking dogs that you raise. So anyway, so we had some action in the local courts. So now, but let me say something about Dan Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. I overlapped. Dan Ellsberg graduated summa cum laude in economics at Harvard, and his senior thesis, 2 articles were published out of it. One in the American Economic Review and one in the Economic Journal. I mean, this guy was something. I met him. He was about to leave for the Marines, and he impressed me as a very kind of naive sort of patriotism. Dan was really devoted to the American military enterprise, and interesting thing about his papers in economics were always finding some kind of a flaw in economic theory and exposing it and giving you the argument against it. It was done. It was just, these got published because they had really interesting things to say. Well, his 4th publication were the Pentagon Papers, and he found a flaw there. You see, his whole career, was it's interesting how his whole career is oriented to that. And in a recent interview, he was asked, what did it take to get you to make that step? Okay, he copied, I don't know, it was tens of thousands of pages, and you do it 1 copy at a time. Smuggle them out of the RAND, and he got them to the New York Times. And then the publication was held up by Nixon challenged it in court. And so it didn't get published right away. But anyway, what did it take to get you to take that step? Ellsberg, it wouldn't have occurred to me simply to do something that would put myself in prison for the rest of my life, which is what I figured it would do. That was not an obvious decision to make, except once I'd seen the example of people like Randy Keeler and Bob Eaton, and he mentions another guy, David Harrison. I don't know who these people are, but these were low-level young men who conscientiously refused to serve. And Dan realized, my gosh, I can have a whole lot more impact than they can, you see. So he did. Now, I don't know. And of course, Ellsberg, Dan was charged under the Espionage Act and would no doubt have been found guilty. But we had one of the many misbehaving presidents we've had at the head of this country. Nixon was sure that the Pentagon Papers probably had something to do with some of the Vietnam decisions that he had made with Henry Kissinger. It didn't. It only covered the earlier years, but he thought it probably did. And so he got the plumbers to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to see if they could get some dirt on him. Well, if you know Dan Ellsberg, it wouldn't have made any difference if they had. But anyway, they got caught. All of that got blown. And so as a result, Dan was scot-free because the government had blown its case. Okay. So, okay. Okay, now I've covered 75 years of change and adaptation. I'm starting when I was 16 years old. You see, was when I was first in Wichita, involved in sort of breaking down some of the practices in Wichita theaters. So race relations in 2018 have hardly a trace of the features so prominent in Wichita, 1943, in Lawrence, 1949, at Harvard, 1955, where I had one black classmate who distinguished himself. Johnson appointed Andy Bremer to the Federal Reserve Board, and he had quite a distinguished career, but that was terribly, terribly unusual, virtually impossible if, like Andy, you were born in a poor Southern black family, okay, sharecropper family. So Dissent on American adventurism, broad though, is still alive, if not always listened to, but an ever-present fact with each new excursion. So these truths, I think, have been part of the American experiment, the ones having to do with race relations and the anti-war movement. They've been part of the American experiment since 1776. It's basically the reason why I'm optimistic about the future and why I think we're going to outlive Trump. We're going to be okay. You see, because this is an aberration, and I think you have to make a case that somehow it's different this time, and maybe it is. But it's hard for me to believe, in the light of this history, you see, that this is going to be the permanent imprint. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
I have the privilege of moderating the Q&A now. There are microphones on either side, so please form an orderly line if you'd like to ask a question. Can you start with your name and affiliation, and please phrase your question as a question and keep it pithy rather than pontificating on a point. It looks like Nigel Ashford is going to have the first question. Although Bob can... Oh, great.
Thank you. Thanks. Do you think that the improvement in race relations would have occurred spontaneously due to the grassroots type changes you suggested, or to what extent did it require some degree of federal state intervention to improve race relations?
And I don't think the mic was actually on. So the question, if I may paraphrase, is do you think that race relations would have come up spontaneously?
Should I do it again?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. I can tell you that I believe and I think that would have been a better way to do it. I think the problem in Brown versus Topeka in 1954 was getting into enforced busing and all the things. And I realize it would have been very slow, but I think the right approach would have been for black and white groups to start form educational opportunities. And you see, the segregation was based in the schools was based upon housing segregation. In Wichita, the blacks lived up around 9th Street north of the main part of Wichita, and that's where the elementary schools that were all black there, and the black woman who challenged that, you see, it was challenged on the grounds that her child deserved the kind of education where she would be able to learn about other peoples and go to school with them. And see, that was kind of the much of the argument. And I think we can't be sure, because it certainly would have been slow. And look, it was set back with the slaughterhouse case by 75 years, you see. But we don't see if that hadn't happened. What we don't know is what would have been a consequence at that time, you see. But it certainly, for those of us that were in the movement, you see, we looked upon that as you know, a huge handicap, with state law actually favoring segregation. So I don't know. I believe, because to me, the thing is, we did see that model working in restaurants, eventually in theaters, all kinds of places. And, of course, those places didn't involve, you know, the housing segregation and the schools tied up with local living arrangements.
If I may, I have a question. Yeah. So you told about stories of individuals who challenged the law and you know, helped to move the anti-segregation movement forward. But do you think, to some degree, you need those individuals who are willing to make that step, as well as organizations such as Fellowship of Reconciliation to be able to provide that backing?
Yes, yes. Those organizations existed because there were individuals like this, but there was plenty of individual actions by people that really, really cared, and I think that's been true in our entire history. From its beginning, there's been people who were dedicated to the American experiment, and actually, you know, made incredible personal sacrifices, and I saw that well, for example, to give you, I didn't mention this, but another illustration of it is Kansas had German immigrants who left Germany under Bismarck because of militarism. They were in the United States precisely to escape militarism. One I knew very well, Harry Graeber, as a young child in the 1930s. Harry had been a conscientious objector in the First World War. Well, he was, of course, suspected of being a spy and all that kind of stuff. It couldn't have been honest. So he went to prison and solitary confinement. And the farm I lived on was a German community. The Hamburgers had escaped Germany because they came to the United States because they were leaving the militarism that was growing. So and of course in the First World War there was for the German population in the First World War, it was like the Japanese population in the Second World War. You see, they were all suspected. So anyway.
Great. Thank you for your talk, Vernon. So you talked about what you like to see is the bottom-up kind of approach to social change and cultural change. Can you talk about the state of public discourse through that lens, and if there's something that you would want to see changed through a bottom-up process, what would it be?
The state of what?
Public discourse.
Oh, public discourse. Oh, I think it's... well, I would like to see us find ways to have more open discussion on campuses, because there isn't. You see, that is being challenged. A lot of people want anyone to speak who may have something hurtful to say about some particular group. And, well, if that's your standards, it's as if almost no one can speak, okay? So that and I think if there's anything we can do as individuals to just persuade our classmates to say, look, we're going to listen. You don't have to agree with these people, okay? You don't have to agree with what they say, but let's listen, and you can ask questions. You can engage them. And I think a lot of what made that bottom-up approach work was it was nonviolent. You see, Martin Luther King, James Farmer of CORE, all of these people were committed to nonviolent action. And that was really important, I think, in the early years, because that would have been taken as an excuse for much more severe repression. And that was, now, of course, later it did become violent. I mean, the Watts riot in 1965 was in many ways a turning point. And although, you know, you can't approve of the violence, I think there is, what was happening that I saw that had changed came out of my experience in trying to break down discrimination in the theaters. And that is, it was always hard to get blacks to join us. Now, it happened that there was a black family, their name happened to be Smith, that we knew, that my mother would invite to our home for dinner, that we got to know quite well. Well, the Smiths would participate, okay, in these actions. But it was very hard to get blacks to participate. And I regret to say that it was, I think, not just a simple matter of fear. What I saw was too much of acceptance of the condition that blacks lived in a sense believing that maybe there was something to it. Okay. And I think that's the thing that changed in the 1960s. The young blacks saying they weren't going to take any more crap, you see. And Andy Brimmer, my classmate at Harvard, I would run into him at meetings from time to time. And I remember at the San Francisco meetings of the American Economic Association, this was in the 1960s, I saw Andy and we started talking, and he said, you know, Vernon, he said, I like to help my people, and so I do a lot of speeches, do a lot of traveling and everything. But he said, I'm getting a lot of trouble because from the young blacks, he said, or the young Negroes. He says, the young Negroes, I'm getting a lot of attack because I refer to my race as Negroes. And I said, well, Andy, I said, what they're saying is really fairly simple. They're saying that if they're Negroes, why aren't we Caucasians? If we're whites, they're blacks. And they were going to be proud black. So it's that simple. There was a double standard, you see, in talking about Negroes and whites. And it took a honky here to explain that to Andy, because he had been so kind of long insulated from all that stuff on the Federal Reserve Board and everything. And I think that's the point, is that the black community were now going to take responsibility and do something about their condition. And I think a group that's being discriminated or abused that is not willing to do that is very hard to do anything about it. I now look back on those experiences in the 40s as just, you know, middle-class whites trying to do good in the black community and not getting very far, you see. And they have to be part of it. And I think that, and the same thing true for the women's movement, all of these movements. I think the responsibility belongs to the people who have gripes.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Bob. I work on the comms team for Mercatus. Your activism that you engaged in when you were young is very admirable. Say, instead of being born in 1927, you were born in 1997 or 2003, something like that. What kind of activism as a young person today do you imagine that you would be involved in? And if you have any advice for young people today on how they can make a meaningful difference in the world, what advice would that be?
Well, that's really hard because I can't, it's very hard for me to look on the 1990s from the perspective of a young person, you see, without my background. However, I would expect them to be very sympathetic to socialism. Young people are always sympathetic to socialism. Hayek was socialist as a young man growing up. And you're coming out of a very successful socialist community, the family, and where there's a lot of sharing, and also socialism sounds good. And if it sounds good, it must be okay, you see. So I'm not surprised that Bernie Sanders has got a following. You know, I'm also not surprised he has a reputation of having some integrity, because that's a very strong thing among American socialists. Debs and Thomas, there isn't anybody that ever would have questioned their integrity, no matter how much they may have been political enemies. They had an incredible reputations. Thomas was very active in social community as well as political affairs all his life, involved in cases, helping prepare evidence on cases, and he was well known for that. So I'm sorry I can't help very much, but I'm just not at all surprised that that Bernie Sanders gets support from young people, of course.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll go ahead and go with the order in which they came, so you'll be after these two. Yep.
Hi, my name is Walter. I'm one of the MA fellows with the Mercatus Center. I was heartened to hear your optimism regarding our country going forward. And today you talked about the racial divides to a certain extent. And but I was wondering, as someone that has lived most of his life in big cities, but was born in a small town in Montana, if you thought that there was also a problem with a rural-urban divide in this country as well, that some people have pointed to in light of this past election, and whether or not that is also another divide that we will have to address from the bottom up going forward.
Yes, I think it is a divide, and of course it surfaced in Trump's election. And one of the reasons why it was such a surprise, is that there were all kinds of people who felt they had no voice in the political process, and saw Trump as an outsider who could change those things, and of course he still plays to that constituency. And I think that, of course, except except for the suburban movement and some reverse migration, by and large, it's diminishing because we now have. I lived on a 160-acre farm in the 1930s. Those are now have been consolidated into 600, 800, 1,000, 1,500 acres, all created by the combine and all of these technologies so that we need almost no one living on those farms in order to produce a huge amount of food.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. My name is Michael Farham. I'm a research fellow at the Mercatus Center. So building on what Nigel opened up with and on another Nobel Prize winner's work, George Stigler, on the economics of discrimination, this is more of a theory-related question. One of the criticism of Stigler's work is he actually dug into the economics of how the discrimination might actually come about, and he showed that the market itself provides incentives for ending discrimination, with the singular exception of when the majority has a taste for discrimination, it may be an enduring kind of thing. So do you see situations to essentially use the law or other means to kind of coerce some type of economic exchange in situations where the bottom-up approach is less likely to work because the majority does hold these misanthropic preferences?
Yeah. No, I think you said George Stigler. I think you meant Gary Becker.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sir.
No, I think Gary's his approach does. You see, discrimination. There's all kinds of ways in which it doesn't pay, and money is being left on the table. You see, and Jack Sprat Restaurant found that out. You see, in Chicago in 1943, that once they started to serve mixed groups, it worked, and moreover, they enjoyed a huge, a crescendo of business coming to Jack Sprat because they were one of the first, you see, to change, and you see, and it takes demonstrations like that. You see, I think more than anything, demonstrations where people can actually see that it is not a problem. And the concern was that if in my restaurant I start serving blacks, whites will quit coming, and I'll end up being there was this belief out there. Well, certainly there were people who are now going to make choices maybe on those grounds, but lots of people, especially you see in the free states, for which that was not a major consideration. See, I went to a high school that was integrated. And the reason is fairly simple. Wichita couldn't afford a separate school for blacks. There weren't that many, you see. In the elementary schools, it was different, but there would have certainly been pressures. And Hispanics, and of course, one of my closest friends was Raymond Reyes in high school. And interesting, I went back for my 20th high school reunion. So that was in 1964. Well, Raymond wasn't there because he wasn't invited. He wasn't welcome 20 years later. Now, I went back for my 50th, and he was there, you see. But even though we went to school together, the people in charge of the social affairs in high school, and you know how that can be. You see, we're actually still calling the shots 20 years later. but you see, it was just all a big bad error, which is now, I think, even recognized by a lot of my classmates. Those of them who are still alive anyway. There's precious few of them. But as of my 50th reunion, you see things had changed quite a lot.
Thank you, Professor Smith. My name is Caesar. I'm with the finance group, IHS and Mercatus. And my question is, to what extent, if any, do you think World War II, Korea, Vietnam advanced the civil rights movement and advanced racial integration?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't get what.
To what degree, if any, do you think that you listed several wars,
World
the
War
Korean
II,
War, World War II,
Korea,
Vietnam War, advanced racial integration?
Well, we had segregated black and the Japanese force in the Second World War, and so they were segregated. More recently, that has changed, but down to the Second World War, there was still a lot of segregation because the military was practicing it too. See, that didn't change in the military until it was changing in our society, and then it changed. And there's nothing better than good example. Okay. And also it's changing on sex identity, things like this. You see, these are all to me welcome changes, and changes that would have been just unthinkable. You see, in my day, although there was no shortage of people that you knew were gay, and generally it was known, including in my own family. You see, but in my family it was just that's the way it is with some people. You see, but it wasn't. It was that the willingness to be open, and for society to be sufficiently accepting that people could be open on those matters. That's the thing that's dramatically new, and I think it's much to be welcomed.
Thank you.
Hi, Vernon. Alex Tabrock. Vernon, there's a story going around associated with the Nancy MacLean Democracy in Chains book, that public choice is a Southern reactionary, sort of racist kind of reactionary kind of pushback. And as someone who worked with CORE and who has also been president of the Public Choice Society, I wondered if you'd speak to that.
Well, it's not, but I'm not surprised that people are making those charges. Anything to try to smear you on matters that really are orthogonal to the intellectual contest of public choice. You see, Jim Buchanan was a Southerner. Well, so what? He doesn't mean he couldn't do great public choice. And he was a Southern gentleman.
If I may ask a second question, we have about 15 minutes left. You talked about challenging and dissent generally, but you didn't quite talk about dissent within the economics profession. And could you say more about some events that you think were monumental throughout your lifetime, and people challenging the core assumptions of economics and the state of the profession today?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's, in some ways, those changes, of course, I've been really close to those. In some ways, those changes are more dramatic even than the ones I've generally been talking about. You know, when I finished my PhD at Harvard in 1955, everybody believed that the notion of competitive markets was a very abstract ideal. That supply and demand theory could only work if you had complete information. Everybody had complete information on supply and demand. And of course, that was all of neoclassical economics. Game theory was predominantly dealing with those sorts of those kind of background conditions. And when I did my first experiment, it came out of the feeling that I didn't know anything about the connection between supply and demand and kind of what people do on the ground. So that's sort of what motivated the experiment. But I never had any doubt but what all of this was true. And in fact, the first experiment I did, in addition to complete information, you had to have a really large number of buyers and sellers, a sea of them, everybody very small compared with the whole, so that all were a price taker. Everybody was a price taker. Well, my first experiment was a two-sided bid-ask market, so everybody was a maker of prices as a taker, and it had 22 people, so that was a small number, and no one knew anything about supply and demand except their own little piece of it. And many of you probably have now been in one of these experiments because they're used widely in teaching. Well, the first one converged to the competitive equilibrium very quickly, and I thought there was something wrong with the experiment. Mm-hmm. So I figured it was because there was too much symmetry. So I did a very asymmetric supply and demand, and it converged. So I realized I was learning stuff that was completely contrary to what was being taught, and it got me hooked. You see, I didn't set out to do experimental economics. I got hooked because I was getting these results that were completely contrary, and moreover, they made sense. You see. And you start to think about convergent processes and what was going on, and you could see what people were doing made a lot of sense if they had an opportunity to adapt and change. You see, in response to the prices out there. Well, that ended up leading to, you see, a whole experimental program, and then 20 years. Let's see, that my paper was published in '62. So, 25 years later, we're no longer running experiments by hand. We're doing them electronically on a computer. That was in the 70s. Okay, so that's maybe 15 years later. But that was in the 70s. That grew out of teaching. I mean, it was an undergraduate in my class who said, Professor Smith, do you know anything about this Plato computer system over in the library at the University of Arizona? No. He said, well, I think might be an interesting way to do experiments. So it was a class where it was organized around not lectures but projects. So the class went over. Well, we ended up, that became our project. And a number of students, and they went on after that class and took another 3, 6, 9 hours in special studies. And so we started, and so I published papers with undergraduates in that class in the American Economic Review. Okay? We were just picking all these little apples all over the place, I mean, moreover, the profession was hungry for that because it was new. There wasn't anybody else doing that, you see. And then Well, and so that was the market stuff. Well, but the biggest problem I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that our real confrontation with, and all of that you see is reinforcing the notion of utility theory, utility outcomes. You see that utility maximization was working in those environments, and then we go to these two-person anonymous games, and none of that is working. And yet we compared since we did graduate workshops in experimental economics from time to time. I've run some of these same I mean, not only graduate, but faculty. I would run these same games with faculty. They didn't play the games at all. They played like game theorists. As a result, they're not making any money. The undergraduates make more money than the faculty. You see, it can't be irrational. But you see, we didn't have, and as I mentioned, until I began to really get serious in trying to understand what Adam Smith's talking about in the theory of moral sentiments, we don't model relationships, you see. We model outcomes, all of economics. We're modeling outcomes, and because we want to make statements about outcomes, policy statements about outcomes, but as a result, we're not going into the causal roots behind a lot of action, and so. And the behavioral economists and many experimental economists say, well, if people are not maximizing their own utility, the thing to do is to put the other person's payoff in their utility function. Well, yeah, you get the right answer there that way, but why is the other person's payoff in the utility function? How did it get there? Why isn't anonymous conditions this a wonderful opportunity to just take all the money? See, none of those are you're not even addressing those questions if you rescue utility theory by putting this other stuff in it. You see, well, I mean, it's the world's worst science, but there's people out there doing it. So, what can I say? And so they talk about social preferences. As my colleague Bart Wilson says in one of his papers, social preferences aren't preferences. And if you go to Adam Smith, everybody is strictly self-loving in the theory of moral sentiments. But you soon find out that that's not the way you can get along with your neighbor. Okay? And as Adam Smith says, starting when we go to school or when we first have playfellows, we find that those playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents. And they don't like it if we do things hurtful. And they let us know. And as Adam Smith says, that's when we enter the great school of self-command, age 5. And we learn to become rule followers. And it's not because we aren't self-interested, but that we, and in fact, if you look at all of the applications of this, of what Smith is talking about, we're automatically assuming that others are all self-interested. Why? Because we right away know from an action who's hurt and who's made better off. How do we know that? To be hurt is to get less. To be made better off is to get more. So in our thinking about the games even, we're using it. So, but that doesn't mean, being self-interested doesn't mean that all your decisions, you see, are driven by that. And so then the rule following comes in, and you get out of that very powerful propositions that are testable, and most of them, and they work in the lab. You see, here's something 250 years later. And I think most of the economics profession is maximizing utility, you see, in this new in the new social preferences way, and I think they're explaining nothing. But that's my opinion, and it probably won't get very far. But there'll be some people pick up on it, and maybe, and we'll see how far it goes.
Ann Hobson.
Thanks, Dr. Smith. My name is Ann Hobson. I work for the Mercatus Center. I run the MA Fellowship. My question for you is, do you think that there is a role for oral history, like you presented today, narrative and sort of qualitative approach to sort of researching collective action problems, and what is that role?
Well, there's a good example of that. You know, the making of experimental economics has been a detailed oral history and interactions of maybe a dozen of us that have been involved in the development of experimental economics, and I think there's just all sorts of questions and issues that come up in that conversation that's not written down anywhere in a paper, you see. And even experimental methodology is not something you learn by reading about it. It's something you learn by doing it. It's just, you know, it's like learning to play the piano. You got to practice. And all the experimental sciences are like that. They have in physics and geology, chemistry, all of these, there's a body of knowledge that has to do with the techniques of you applying and testing theories, and those techniques have little, if anything, to do with the theory and with the main astronomy. My colleague, when I was at the University of Arizona, Roger Angel, he's a great astronomer, but even more, he's a great inventor. Underneath the football stadium at the University of Arizona, he took that over, and he manufactures telescopes there. He's got engineers, he's got machinists, an army of people involved in creating the stuff he needs for observation. And now that's rare. Usually there's kind of a separation. But it's a beautiful example, you see, where the scientist himself is concerned enough about his instruments that he takes an active part in their design and their development. But anyway, you see, those kinds of things do come out in oral history that you don't. Because Roger doesn't publish papers on, about that enterprise over in, because it's something, the body of knowledge is something that's largely like in experimental economics, the body of knowledge having to do with the techniques of running experiments. Students learn it from the other students. The graduate students learn it by doing it, and it becomes a part of a culture that is sort of independent in many ways of what the mainstream of that science may be doing.
So you've been so gracious giving your presentation and the questions. I wonder if you would be gracious enough to go over time for one more question.
Oh, sure. I've got plenty of time.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Smith. My name is Jack Shannon. I'm an outreach associate with Mercatus. Do you see the same similarities that I do between the Alien and Sedition Acts and some of the president's policy decisions over the past few years So his public shaming of what he sees as anti-American news outlets, the shaming of the kneeling football players, and most specifically the travel ban that he placed on a number of countries. I sort of see that as being similar policies to alien sedition. And if you agree, do you see them as being short-lived, like this Edition X?
Well, we have a president that's not very tolerant of dissent. When he's as antithetical to his own kind of purposes. And I think the thing that's refreshing about Donald Trump is that he tells you what outrageous thing he's going to do, and then he does it. I mean, Dick Nixon would never tell you. I mean, most presidents tell you one thing and do another, you see. So there's a certain, and actually that appeals to a lot of his constituents, you see, who feels that that's part of challenging the establishment. They like that. And I don't know what percentage that is, but it's probably, I wouldn't be surprised that it's a pretty hard core of 35%. And we'll see how he does, though, in the upcoming election.
Now, we are at time, but your friend would like to ask a question.
There's my friend, Rob Gassaway, who will introduce himself.
Hi, Vernon. I'm Rob Gassaway. I tell you, what was fascinating to me is you were giving that little oral history of socialism from your standpoint. What has changed now is the Great Succession has ended, right? You start with Debs, and then you go to Thomas, and then you go to Michael Harrington, almost in quick succession, and they're authors, and they're academics, and they're political leaders. And then when you get to the end of Harrington, a couple things happen. Number one, the Soviet Union is no longer there. So you're no longer opposing some international socialism that you don't like. And then number two, a couple of changes that I've noticed. You mentioned the problem of people on the left being anti-free speech now, and you would never have that, I don't think, in the Debs or the Thomas or the Harrington era. And the second thing that I noticed is that intellectual growth, which used to be so prevalent, it may be apparent in you or in Hayek, or if you look at the list of Reagan Medal of Freedom winners, right? Whittaker Chambers or James Burnham or Sidney Hook. Socialism was a great training ground for anti-socialist academics in previous days. But that's not happening either. And surely that might have something to do with the fact that socialism is now anti-free speech. So there are three trends: no more Soviet Union, much less support for free speech, and much less evidence of academic growth in the socialism post-1990, post-Michael Harrington. Explain that as the world's reigning genius.
Wow. Well, I'm going to rest with that as a challenge. And I know that Rob himself, by the way, has been doing interesting stuff on kind of forms of rationality that are emerging from our judicial system, that have to do with kind of the notion of rationality that is coming out of sort of a collective wisdom, and I think and in fact Rob gave a talk at University of Alaska that was in some ways it's kind of background to what I talked about, because it helped me to channel me into thinking in terms of kind of my experiences and what kind of, and all the good stuff that's filtered out of the bad, you see. And I think that's really is very much the American experience, and I believe it's here to stay.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and